Let me tell you about this article that's up on Infowars.com by Steve Watson. Latest unedited Planned Parenthood video confirms that aborted babies are being sold to create super mice. Now, again, this is a kind of transgenetic modification, combining elements of one species to the other. We don't like to see that in our food, and I certainly don't like to see that in our animals. Aborting and using children for this kind of Franken-science. Listen to this. The brains of aborted babies are being transplanted into mice in labs. Now, this is taken from The Scientist and the Journal of Neuroscience that are indicating that. They say essentially the fetus brains are minced. That's the actual words used in the paper published in the Journal of Neuroscience. And the glial cells, cells that support neurons in the nervous system, were extracted and injected into lab mice. The mice incorporated with the glial cells from these human babies into their brains, quote, outperformed normal mice almost fourfold in the variety of cognition tests. Now, this would almost be funny if it wasn't so gruesome. It's kind of a pinky in the brain type of science, but it is absolutely disgusting. And, of course, there were some questions in the debate on Thursday about involvement with Planned Parenthood. One of those was put out to Jeb Bush, and he said no. They questioned him, and they said, you were director of a Bloomberg Foundation that gave $10 million to Planned Parenthood. I said, I didn't know anything about that. I was in that Bloomberg Foundation because I wanted to enact Common Core. That's a great excuse, isn't it? So he's director of a foundation with Bloomberg, pushing Common Core and giving $10 million to Planned Parenthood. Jeb Bush, one of the Bush clan. But then in his defense, he said, no, I'm a pro-life governor. Let me tell you, we cut off funding to Planned Parenthood. And I thought, well, it'd be interesting to see how much money he did cut off from Planned Parenthood. Well, here's what they did. Two vetoes that he did. He vetoed line item vetoes. Bush vetoed $115,000 in funding for Northeast Florida Planned Parenthood in Duval County. And he vetoed $187,000 for Department of Health contracts with Planned Parenthood of Collier and Sarasota counties. So if you load that up, combine those two, that's about $300,000 in state funding to Planned Parenthood that George Bush vetoed. However, his private foundation gave 30 times that amount to Planned Parenthood, over $10 million. So on the one hand, he publicly, the public face of Jeb Bush, says, I'm cutting funding to Planned Parenthood, and he cuts $300,000, but then privately, along with the Bloomberg Foundation, Jeb Bush gives them $10 million. How's that? 30 times as much. That's the kind of hypocrisy that we see coming from these people. That's the kind of mask that they wear. And as we pointed out last week, and it bears repeating again, back in 1947, Prescott Bush ran the first national fundraiser for Planned Parenthood. Their national goal at the time was $2 million. And remember, inflation going back to 1947. Look at this letterhead, guys. Get a copy of this, because here's a blown-up picture of this letter. On the stationery, on the top left-hand side, we have Margaret Sanger, honorary chairman. Thank you. Sorry. And then on the right-hand side, we have Prescott Bush, treasurer. So Margaret Sanger on the left, Prescott Bush, grandfather of Jeb and W, on the right as treasurer for their first nationwide campaign. And the letter was signed by Margaret Sanger. And here's some of what she says. This means the coming of age of our organization. The enclosed pamphlet, The Nation's Strength, outlines our plans and our objectives. It will mark the first major step in integrating Planned Parenthood and the health and welfare services of the country, nationwide plan. This is not an appeal for funds. We wanted you to know in advance what our plans and our hopes are. So this is Prescott Bush, treasurer, working with Margaret Sanger. When it became known that he was working with, at the time it was called the Birth Control Society, he was knocked out of an expected victory of a Senate seat in 1950, but then, of course, he later got involved with that. And, of course, it was not only the grandfather, but, of course, George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush have been very actively involved in raising money for Planned Parenthood. We have a letter, and we talked about this at the end of last week, in March of 1972 from George Bush, about raising money and working with the people at Planned Parenthood to help them raise money. And so we see then that the grandson now, Jeb Bush, is part of an organization that gives $10 million to Planned Parenthood while trumpeting the fact that he shut off $300,000 of state funding. That's the way it goes. Oh, he also got rid of the Planned Parenthood license plates. They haven't done that in Virginia. We have the story from Kit Daniels on Infowars.com. Virginia has banned the Confederate flag plates, but not the Planned Parenthood plates. You can still get those in Virginia, just not a Confederate flag plate. But of course, we should think that Jeb Bush is pro-life because he banned Planned Parenthood plates in Florida and cut 1/30th of the amount of money that he and his private organization donated to Planned Parenthood. And then this last thing about Jeb Bush. 8 months ago, the day after Christmas, it came out in the Daily News that Jeb Bush had resigned from a company that had cashed in on Obamacare. They say his presidential ambitions are looking healthier now that he's dropped out of Obamacare. Tenet Healthcare Corporations, and he was on the board of directors there. They've made a lot of money, they say. They paid from Obamacare, and they paid Bush $2.3 million from 2007 to 2013 as he was a director on a company that profited from Obamacare, just as he was a director of a company that donated $10 million to Planned Parenthood. That's pro-life Jeb.
In the past decade, we have witnessed unparalleled scientific discoveries in the area of health. But no one has put together a formula that focuses directly on brain health, nerve growth factors, and optimizing your cellular energy at the same time. DNA Force is one of the most expensive formulas to produce. Some of the ingredients in DNA Force are $12,000 a kilogram. We are using the coveted, patented, only American source of PQQ, CoQ10, and more. You want the best that's out there at the lowest price anywhere? Well, we're bringing you a total win-win. The ultimate value, cutting-edge, trailblazing game changer that also supports the InfoWar. We have produced a limited run of DNA Force, and it will take up to 12 weeks to produce more once we sell out. Secure your DNA Force today at InfoWarsLife.com or call toll-free 888-253-3139. DNA Force from InfoWars Life.
Mark in North Carolina. Mark, you wanted to talk about Bush and Christie, you said? Go ahead.
Yeah, the first thing I wanted to say was about, as far as Christie goes, sorry, I think Paul was too gentle with him.
Yeah.
We've also reminded him that Christie wanted to force states like Colorado use federal force basically to get them to let go of their marijuana laws. In other words, that they should, that even though they legalized it, he would force them to delegitimize it. And
exactly. He said that if he becomes president, he's going to force Colorado and Washington states that have decriminalized marijuana, he is going to remove that as president. And let me ask you, Mark, what's the constitutional authority for that?
Well, he has no constitutional authority. That's actual states' rights.
That's right.
The thing is, they talk about the civil rights movement sometimes, but what they don't understand is everybody has constitutional rights. The Bill of Rights is for everybody. And when a state denies people their constitutional rights, as they did with black people in certain southern states and some other states too, then it is a federal responsibility to do something. But this isn't the case with marijuana. You're not violating it. Nobody's rights are being violated in the state of Colorado. They have every right. The people decided they want to legalize marijuana. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about was Bush. Okay.
Well, wait, before we leave that topic, we had an article up last week, and it said the federal government doesn't have the right to ban anything. And we know that's the case because of alcohol prohibition. They had to have a constitutional amendment to ban alcohol, to prohibit it. And we got another one, the 21st Amendment, that made it legal again. Why did they need that? Because there is nothing in the Constitution that says that the federal government can ban alcohol, that they can ban cancer drugs, or that they can ban marijuana or anything else. They don't have that right. The 9th and 10th Amendment says if you're not explicitly given the right to do something, that power is retained by the people, by the states. So they have no legal basis for the war on drugs whatsoever.
And as far as guns go, really, that's where the federal government probably should interfere. Because, again, people's civil rights, their constitutional rights are being denied in states like New York or Christie's, New Jersey, okay, whereby it's almost impossible to even own a gun, to even have one in your home, let alone to have one to be able to carry one. So that's where the federal government probably should interfere, because these are illegal laws that the states are depriving people of their civil rights, constitutional rights. The other thing I want to talk about the Bush family is I'm just finishing up this book called Family of Secrets. It's by a guy named Russ Baker. And this is really a sleazy family. I personally believe, first of all, Prescott Bush was definitely a supporter of Hitler, as well as Planned Parenthood.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we know from the bank connections about that, yes. Go ahead.
W. Bush, I believe, and there's good evidence, not only in this book, I read other books too, like Jerome Corsi's book and all that, is H.W. was involved in JFK's murder. And I also believe he was involved in the shooting of Ronald Reagan, because the Bush family and the Hinckley family were actually very close friends. A lot of people don't know this. I looked it up. I knew this before, too, and I looked it up just to make sure. They were actually close friends. Too many coincidences happened with the Bushes. And on top of it, H.W. was actually in the CIA long before he became director of the CIA.
Oh, yes. We were told that he didn't have any involvement with the Bay of Pigs or anything, and yet it just turned out that two of the ships that were there were Zapata and Barbara were the name of them. And, of course, what was H.W.'s oil company? It was Zapata Oil, and his wife was Barbara. Why would they pick George Bush to head the CIA at its lowest point after the church committee hearings? Just because the guy was heavily involved in the CIA. Obviously he was. He's part of that mafia, part of that gangster mafia. Go ahead.
On top of all of that, the Bushes, and not only the Saudis, but the actual bin Laden are very close together. Bin Laden actually, I think bin Laden's brother actually owned a company, though they tried to cover it up a little bit, in Houston years before, I think back in the 1980s. This family is, I'm telling you, this family is dirty, Dave.
Oh, absolutely.
To push it out.
Absolutely. Very dirty, and we can see the same types of stuff that we see with the Clinton family and all the issues with corruption, with crime, with people around them committing suicide. That's what we see with both of these families. We have essentially a Game of Thrones with a couple of different mafia families pushing this through.
This is An American President. Just add puppet, then vote and repeat every 4 years.
Are minced, that's the actual words used in the paper published in the Journal of Neuroscience, and the glial cells that support neurons in the nervous system, were extracted and injected into lab mice. The mice incorporated with the glial cells from these human babies into their brain. Let me tell you about this article that's up on Infowars.com by Steve Watson. Latest unedited Planned Parenthood video confirms that aborted babies are being sold to create super mice. Now, again, this is a kind of transgenetic modification, combining elements of one species to the other. We don't like to see that in our food, and I certainly don't like to see that, quote, outperformed normal mice almost fourfold in the variety of cognition tests. Now, this would almost be funny if it wasn't so gruesome. It's kind of a pinky in the brain type of science, but it is absolutely disgusting. And, of course, there were some in our animals aborting and using children for this kind of Franken-science. Listen to this. The brains of aborted babies are being transplanted into mice in labs. Now, this is taken from The Scientist and the Journal of Neuroscience that are indicating that. They say essentially the fetus brains